She sat in seat 12B, a figure easily lost in the anonymous sea of travelers. With her faded gray hoodie pulled loosely over her head, a few stray strands of brown hair escaping to frame a face devoid of makeup, she could have been anyone: a student returning from a backpacking trip, a daughter on her way to a family obligation. She clutched a simple, worn canvas bag on her lap, its strap frayed from years of use, an object as unassuming as its owner. To the casual observer, Hilara Vance was just another passenger, a quiet placeholder in the grand, humming ecosystem of Flight 815. The cabin was a world suspended between destinations, a sterile tube of recycled air and muted anxieties. The initial thrill of takeoff had long since faded, replaced by the monotonous drone of the engines, a sound that lulled most passengers into a state of placid boredom. Across the aisle, Marcus Thorne, a man whose expensive suit seemed to wear him as much as he wore it, had finally ended a self-important phone call, his voice a booming declaration of quarterly earnings and leveraged buyouts. He now scowled at a spreadsheet on his laptop, his gold watch glinting under the dim cabin light with every impatient tap of his fingers. A few rows ahead, Genevieve Croft, a woman sculpted by wealth and entitlement, examined her perfectly manicured nails with a critical eye, occasionally dabbing a spot of fragrant lotion onto her wrists. She had already sent back her sparkling water twice, complaining that the lime wedge was insufficiently chilled. They were all playing their parts in the familiar theater of air travel. The young couple in front of Hilara shared a pair of headphones, their heads leaning together. A child in the back was beginning a fretful cry, quickly shushed by an exhausted mother. It was a perfectly ordinary flight, a collection of separate lives temporarily bound together by the shared trajectory of a pressurized aluminum shell hurtling through the stratosphere. Hilara alone seemed disconnected from this shared reality. She wasn't reading, nor was she lost in the blue glow of a screen. Her gaze was fixed out the small, thick window, but she wasn't admiring the endless carpet of clouds below. Her stillness was absolute, a profound calm that was subtly different from the boredom surrounding her. It was the stillness of a predator, or of a watchman on a lonely post. Her ears, finely tuned by a past she never spoke of, were sifting through the layers of sound, the consistent hum of the engines, the whisper of the ventilation, the faint creak of the fuselage. She was listening to the aircraft, listening to it breathe. The first jolt was minor, a slight hiccup in the air that barely registered with most passengers. It was dismissed with nervous laughter, the kind of turbulence that served only to remind them they were, in fact, flying. Marcus Thorne grunted in annoyance as his screen flickered. Genevieve sighed dramatically, placing a protective hand over her silk blouse. But Hilara felt it differently. It wasn't a simple bump. It was a shearing motion, a lateral shudder that spoke of clashing air masses. Her eyes, which had been soft and unfocused, sharpened instantly. Her posture, previously relaxed, became imperceptibly straighter. The subtle shift in G-force, a feeling she knew as intimately as her own heartbeat, sent a cold, familiar signal up her spine. This was not ordinary weather. Then came the second jolt, harder this time. The plane didn't just shudder, it dropped. A collective gasp swept through the cabin, sharp and sudden. A flight attendant's cart rattled precariously, and a half-empty cup of coffee slid from a tray table, splashing a dark stain across the gray carpet. The child in the back was no longer crying fretfully. It was a full-throated wail of terror. The seatbelt sign chimed on with an insistent, almost panicked tone. A voice, strained but attempting cheerfulness, crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. We're just experiencing a bit of unexpected weather. Please return to your seats and make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened." The words were meant to be reassuring, but the tremor in the flight attendant's voice betrayed the sentiment. Fear, once a subtle undercurrent, was now a palpable entity in the cabin. Knuckles turned white on armrests. Anxious glances were exchanged between strangers. The hum of the engines was now joined by a low, mournful groan from the airframe as it fought against the turbulent sky. Hilara's focus narrowed to a pinpoint. She ignored the rising panic around her. The fear of others was just noise, a distraction from the data her senses were gathering. The pitch of the engine whine had changed, a subtle increase that suggested the pilots were fighting for altitude. The groan of the metal was a language she knew all too well, a dialect learned in screaming winds over jagged peaks, not in the comfortable drone of a commercial liner. And there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible pressure change in her inner ears. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The action was smooth, deliberate, and it drew an immediate, disapproving look from the man next to her. She ignored him. Waiting for the right moment, she caught the eye of a young flight attendant hurrying down the aisle, her face a pale mask of forced composure. The name tag on her uniform read Jenna. "Excuse me," Ilara said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the nervous chatter with surprising clarity. Jenna stopped, her professional smile stretched thin. "Ma'am, please return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt." "I will," Ilara replied, her gaze steady. "I just have a question. The pressure differential is fluctuating, isn't it? Or is it just my ears?" The technical nature of the question caught Jenna completely off guard. It wasn't the typical panicked inquiry about the weather. It was specific, analytical. For a moment, the flight attendant's composure cracked. Her eyes darted around as if looking for an answer in the chaotic cabin. "Ma'am," she said, her voice a little sharper now, a defense mechanism against the unfamiliar. "Everything is under control. The flight crew is handling the situation. Please, sit down." She forced the brittle smile back onto her face and quickly moved on, her mission to project calm undermined by the quiet passenger in 12B. The exchange, though brief, did not go unnoticed. Marcus Thorne, who had been trying to secure his laptop, let out a loud, derisive scoff. He leaned toward his companion, a younger man in a similar suit, and spoke in a stage whisper that was designed to be overheard. "Can you believe that? An armchair pilot. Every time there's a little chop, someone who watched a documentary on the Discovery Channel thinks they're an aviation expert." His companion chuckled obsequiously. "I know, right? What's she going to do? Tell the captain he's flying wrong?" Across the aisle, Genevieve Croft had witnessed the interaction with a look of profound distaste. She subtly shifted in her seat, angling her body away from Ilara as if her presence were a physical contagion. She whispered to the woman beside her, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Honestly, the sort of people they let on planes these days. Look at what she's wearing. She probably thinks cabin pressure is a term for feeling claustrophobic. It's making everyone more nervous." The plane dropped again, more violently this time. A few screams punctuated the air. The overhead bins rattled ominously, and the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into a half-second of terrifying darkness before the emergency power kicked in, casting everything in a ghostly, dim glow. The fear was no longer contained. It was a living thing, breathing in the stale air, its tendrils wrapping around every passenger. A man a few rows back began to pray loudly in Spanish. The young couple who had been sharing headphones were now gripping each other's hands, their faces ashen. Through it all, Ilara remained a pocket of unsettling calm. She had returned to her seat and buckled her belt as requested, but her attention was not inside the plane. She was once again looking out the window, but now she saw what others didn't. She saw the unnatural, bruised purple and gray coloration of the clouds, the telltale signs of a cumulonimbus formation far more severe than a standard storm cell. She saw the faint flicker of lightning not beside them, but within the very cloud they were entering. Her lack of panic, her focused stillness, began to actively unnerve those around her. It was unnatural. In a sea of terrified faces, her placid expression seemed like an accusation. It felt like she knew something they didn't, and her silence was more frightening than any scream. The father of the crying child glared at her from across the aisle. "Can you at least try to look concerned?" he snapped, his voice tight with fear and frustration. "You're freaking my kid out." Ilara turned her head slowly, her calm eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was no anger in her gaze, no judgment, only a deep, unnerving placidity. She offered no reply. What could she say? That his fear was justified, but useless? That the real problem wasn't the violent shaking, but the subtle signs of system strain she was detecting? That the change in pressure she'd felt was the first symptom of a cascade failure that the pilots might not even be fully aware of yet? To say anything would be to create more panic, To do nothing was to be condemned. She turned back to the window. The world outside was a churning vortex of gray and black, a maelstrom that threatened to swallow them whole. Inside the cabin, another storm was brewing, one of fear, prejudice, and judgment, with her as its silent, unwilling center. She closed her eyes for a second, not in fear, but in focus. The insults and the glares were irrelevant. They were background noise. The only thing that mattered was the groaning of the plane, the song of the storm, and the chilling, quiet whisper in her mind that told her this was no longer a matter of just getting through some turbulence. This was now a matter of survival. And in the entire aircraft, filled with over 200 people, she was beginning to suspect she was the only one who truly understood the odds. The brief flicker of the lights was a prelude. The real darkness came seconds later, ushered in by a deafening bang that seemed to emanate from the right side of the aircraft. It was not the sound of turbulence. It was the sound of something breaking, a deep, concussive report that vibrated through the floor, up through the seats, and into the very bones of everyone on board. For a full 3 seconds, every light in the cabin extinguished, plunging them into absolute, terrifying blackness. The emergency lighting had not yet compensated, and the only illumination came from the violent, strobing flashes of lightning outside, which froze the passengers' faces in silent, screaming tableaus. In those brief, stark flashes, Alara could see expressions of pure, primal terror, mouths wide open, eyes reflecting the storm. Then, the dim emergency lights flickered back to life, casting long, eerie shadows down the aisle. But the reassuring drone of the engines was gone. It had been replaced by a disconcerting asymmetry of sound. The engine on the left was still whining, straining, but the one on the right was gone, leaving behind a hollow, whistling wind and the horrifying groan of a massive airframe being dragged through the sky with half its power. Panic, which had been a rising tide, now became a tidal wave. The carefully constructed veneer of civilization dissolved. People were openly weeping. The man who had been praying in Spanish was now shouting his words, his voice cracking with desperation. A woman in business class unbuckled her belt and tried to stand, only to be thrown back into her seat as the plane lurched into a sickening, uncontrolled bank to the right, pulled down by the weight of its dead engine. Jenna, the flight attendant, was trying to make her way down the aisle, her face a mess of terror and determination. "Everyone, please, stay in your seats. Please, stay calm," she pleaded, but her words were lost in the cacophony of fear. Her eyes fell on Alara. In the entire chaotic cabin, Seat 12B was an island of unnerving tranquility. Alara hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. Her hands rested on her canvas bag, her knuckles not even white. She was simply watching, listening, processing. This absolute lack of an external reaction was, to Jenna, more unsettling than the loudest scream. In her fear-addled state, she misinterpreted Alara's composure not as control, but as a chilling, sociopathic detachment. She stumbled to Alara's row, grabbing the seat back for support. "Ma'am," she said, her voice shrill, "I need you to do something. Yell, cry, something. You're making people nervous with all this calm." Alara looked up at the terrified young woman, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she spoke in a voice that was more than a quiet question. It was low, steady, and devoid of emotion. "Shaking won't restart the engine," she stated, not as an argument, but as a simple, undeniable fact. The words, so logical and so cold, struck Jenna like a slap. She flinched as if burned, muttering something about know-it-all passengers before turning away, her attempt to enforce order collapsing into her own personal fear. The exchange was the spark that lit the fuse. Marcus Thorne had seen it all. He saw Alara's unnatural calm and the flight attendant's subsequent retreat as a breakdown in the social order, and his entire life was built upon maintaining that order with himself at the top. Fear manifested in him as rage and a desperate need to assert control. He unbuckled his seatbelt, a difficult task in the lurching cabin, and stood up, planting his feet wide for balance. He pointed a trembling but accusatory finger at Alara. "You," he bellowed, his voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms, now straining to be heard over the wind and the weeping. "I don't know who you think you are, But your attitude is a menace. You are actively making this crisis worse." Heads turned. In their terror, the passengers were desperate for a villain, a single focal point for their amorphous dread. Marcus was offering them one. "This is an emergency," he continued, his face flushed. "We need solidarity, not whatever this is. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Some kind of sick thrill." Genevieve Croft, seeing her chance, chimed in from her seat, her voice sharp and piercing. "He's right. She's been a problem from the start. Look at her. She clearly doesn't belong here. Her presence is disruptive. Security should do something." The suggestion of security was absurd in their current context, but it resonated with the passengers' need for an authority figure to solve their problem. And their problem, at that moment, wasn't the failing engine. It was the woman in the gray hoodie who refused to be scared with them. The cruelest blow came from the back. Cody, the young man in the designer tracksuit, had his phone out. With a shaky hand, he was filming Alara, the red recording light a malevolent dot in the gloom. "Yo, check out this psycho," he narrated, his voice a mixture of fear and mocking bravado. "We're all about to die, and she's just chillin'. Bet she's one of those disaster junkies. This is going straight to TikTok if we live." His friend snickered nervously, the sound sharp and ugly. The flash from his phone's camera went off, momentarily illuminating Alara in a harsh white light. She didn't flinch. She didn't shield her eyes. The cruel wave of accusations, the laughter, the recording phone, it all washed over her, barely registering. Her mind was a world away from their petty drama, deep inside the dying machine that was carrying them all. She could feel the pilot fighting the yaw, the plane wanting to corkscrew toward its dead engine. She could hear the strain on the remaining engine as it was pushed past its limits. Her internal clock was counting. How long since the blowout? 90 seconds. How long have we been in this uncontrolled bank? 45. She was running through checklists in her head, procedures learned in simulators where the only penalty for failure was a reset button, and in skies where there was no reset button at all. Her fingers, moving with a will of their own, unzipped the canvas bag on her lap. The other passengers saw the movement, and a new wave of whispers began. What is she doing? What is she taking out? She pulled out a small, dog-eared notebook, its cover held together with black electrical tape. It was filled not with diary entries, but with handwritten notes, complex equations, and aerodynamic diagrams. Genevieve saw it and rolled her eyes. Oh, wonderful. She's journaling, probably composing her heroic last words. Alara ignored them. She flipped it open to a specific page, a diagram of a commercial jet's hydraulic system. Her finger traced one of the lines, not reading, but feeling. It was a grounding technique, a physical anchor to connect her body to the furious calculations happening in her mind. They've likely lost primary hydraulics on the right side. Are they switching to the rat? Can they even deploy it in a bank this steep? The plane gave a sudden, violent shudder, followed by a sickening, prolonged drop. It wasn't turbulence. It was a stall. The nose dipped, and for a few horrifying seconds, a sense of weightlessness filled the cabin. Loose items, phones, books, a child's stuffed animal floated eerily in the air before crashing down as the pilots fought to regain control. Above them, a series of panels snapped open with a loud hiss, and yellow oxygen masks tumbled down, dangling on their plastic tubes like grotesque fruit. This was the final, undeniable proof. This was not a situation that was being handled. The screams became frantic, desperate. Passengers fumbled with the masks, pulling them over their faces, their eyes wide with terror above the yellow cups. The air filled with the sound of panicked, ragged breathing. Marcus Thorne was thrown back into his seat by the drop, his face pale and slick with sweat. His arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw, undisguised fear of a man who had just realized his money and status were utterly worthless. Genevieve was hyperventilating, her manicured nails digging into the armrest. Cody had dropped his phone, his mocking laughter replaced by a choked sob. They had their scapegoat, but their hatred had done nothing to stop their descent. They were all falling together. It was in this moment, at the absolute apex of chaos and despair, that the intercom crackled to life again. But it wasn't the calm, recorded message about the oxygen masks. It was the captain's voice, raw and strained, cutting through a thick wall of static. He wasn't speaking to the passengers. His words were not meant for them. It was a broadcast into the void, a final, desperate call. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Flight 815, engine failure and critical hydraulic loss. We are in an uncontrolled descent. He paused, and a burst of static filled the air before his voice returned, imbued with a strange, new urgency, as if he had just remembered one last, improbable option. This is a blind transmission to any monitoring stations. Is there anyone on this frequency who can relay a message? We are calling for call sign, Ghost Talon 7. The cabin, which seconds before had been a symphony of terror, fell into a sudden, shocked silence. The screaming stopped, the weeping quieted to whimpers. Even the ragged breathing into the oxygen masks seemed to pause. I repeat, the captain's voice crackled, desperate and clear in the sudden stillness. We have a critical flight systems failure and are requesting immediate assistance from call sign Ghost Talon 7. If you are on this aircraft, please identify yourself to the flight crew. Acknowledge Ghost Talon 7. The transmission ended, leaving behind only the howling wind and the groaning of the plane. Every head, every single one, turned. Eyes darted around the cabin, searching, questioning. What was a call sign? What in God's name was a Ghost Talon 7? The name sounded like something from a movie, a phantom from a secret war, utterly alien to the sterile environment of a commercial flight. They looked at each other, their faces blank with confusion. They looked at the flight attendants, who seemed just as bewildered. And then, slowly, a few pairs of eyes, then a few more drifted uncertainly toward the front of the economy cabin. They drifted towards the unassuming woman in the faded gray hoodie, who was still sitting calmly, her hand resting on an old taped-up notebook in the middle of the storm. They drifted to seat 12B. The silence that followed the captain's desperate call was heavier and more terrifying than the noise it had replaced. It was a vacuum, filled with the unspoken question that now hung in the air like the useless oxygen masks. For a few drawn-out seconds, the only sounds were the whistling wind outside and the frantic, thumping heartbeats of over 200 people. The passengers looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning, impossible suspicion. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to defy the violent lurching of the plane, Alara Vance closed her notebook. The soft thud of the cover meeting the pages was an impossibly small sound, yet it echoed through the silent cabin like a gavel. She placed the notebook in her canvas bag, her movements economical and unhurried. As she calmly removed her oxygen mask, letting it dangle by its cord, every eye was locked on her. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The click of the metal latch was a definitive, punctuating sound. She stood up. The effect was electric. A collective, audible gasp swept through the cabin. This was it. This was the answer to the impossible question. The quiet woman, the weirdo, the scapegoat in the hoodie, she was Ghost Talon 7. The idea was so ludicrous, so utterly contrary to every prejudice they held, that their minds struggled to process it. Ilara took a single step into the aisle. The plane chose that moment to dip sharply, and for the first time, she showed a sign of the incredible forces at play, her hand shooting out to grip the back of a seat to steady herself. It was a movement of pure reflex, as natural and instantaneous as a cat righting itself in midair. Her path forward, toward the cockpit, was blocked. It was blocked by Marcus Thorne. He was still standing, his feet braced, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, fear, disbelief, and a deep, ingrained arrogance that refused to be silenced even in the face of death. He saw her stand, and his mind, incapable of accepting the reality before him, defaulted to its factory setting. Outrage. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, his voice regaining some of its boardroom bluster. "Sit down. This is not some game. You heard the captain. This is a real emergency." He was physically blocking the aisle, his body a wall of expensive wool and terrified pride. Alara didn't respond. She simply met his gaze. Her eyes were not angry or frightened. They were cold and clear, like a winter sky, and in them, Marcus saw a reflection of his own pathetic, blustering fear. He saw himself for what he was, a man in a suit, completely and utterly powerless. "She's insane!" Genevieve Croft shrieked from her seat, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. "She's having a psychotic break. Someone stop her. You can't let her near the cockpit. She'll kill us all." Her words gave voice to the lingering disbelief of the other passengers. It was easier to believe Alara was crazy than to accept the alternative. A few people started to murmur in agreement. "She's right, stop her. This is a hijacking." But before anyone else could move, Ilara spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant quality that cut through the hysteria and drilled into the core of everyone present. She did not look at Genevieve. Her eyes remained locked on Marcus Thorne. "You have a choice, sir," she said, her voice a flat, emotionless calm. "You can stand there and continue to obstruct me, in which case we will have approximately 4 minutes until the fuselage experiences catastrophic failure due to uncontrolled stress. Or you can sit down and give me a chance to prevent that from happening." She paused, letting the clinical precision of her words sink in. "Because of your last outburst, that 4 minutes is now 3.5. Your prejudice is consuming the one resource we have left: time." The blood drained from Marcus Thorne's face. The words catastrophic failure and uncontrolled stress were not the vague fears of a layman. They were delivered with the terrifying certainty of an expert. He looked into her eyes and saw not madness, but a depth of knowledge and an absolute lack of fear that was more intimidating than any threat. He was a man who understood leverage, and he had just realized he held none. He stumbled backward, collapsing into his seat as if his legs had been cut out from under him. The aisle was clear. Ilara began to walk. It was not a normal walk. The floor was tilted at a severe angle, the plane still in a dangerous bank. She moved with a strange, fluid grace, her center of gravity low, her hand brushing the tops of the seats for balance. She moved like someone accustomed to unstable surfaces, to a world that was not level. As she passed Genevieve's seat, the woman recoiled, pressing herself against the window as if Alara's faded hoodie might contaminate her designer clothes. She passed Cody, who was still frozen, his phone clutched in his hand, its red light still blinking. He had been filming the psycho, but he was now inadvertently documenting the walk of a ghost. As she neared the front of the plane, a flight attendant, not Jenna, but an older, more senior one, stepped out from the galley, her face pale but resolute. "Ma'am, you cannot go any further. I need you to return to your seat." Alara didn't break her stride. "Tell the captain," she said, her voice calm, and even as she walked past, "that Ghost Talon 7 is here to assist." The flight attendant's jaw dropped. The call sign, spoken so calmly by this unassuming woman, was the key. She nodded dumbly and scrambled for the intercom phone. The cockpit door was just ahead. As Alara reached it, it was thrown open from the inside. The co-pilot, a young man with terror etched deep into the lines around his eyes, stood there. He was drenched in sweat, his uniform collar askew. He stared at Alara, his gaze sweeping over her from her worn boots to her plain face. You're," he stammered, his mind unable to reconcile the legend of the call sign with the woman standing before him. Alara didn't waste a second. She pointed past him, into the cockpit, where the captain was wrestling with the controls. "Your pitch control is failing," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative, a complete transformation from her earlier quietness. "You're getting false readings from your horizontal stabilizer. You're fighting the plane, not the storm. Let me in." Before the co-pilot could even respond, the captain spun around in his seat. He was an older man, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. But when his eyes landed on Alara, a flicker of something wild and unbelievable ignited in them, a spark of desperate hope. "My God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It is you, Alara Vance. We heard you were gone after the Andes incident." "The reports were exaggerated," Alara said, her tone clipped. "All business. There's no time for a reunion. Your auxiliary power unit is bleeding hydraulic fluid. You have about 90 seconds before you lose all flight controls." She stepped past the stunned co-pilot and into the cramped space of the cockpit. The chaotic symphony of alarms and warning lights washed over her, not as a source of panic, but as a familiar, data-rich environment. Her eyes scanned the myriad of dials and screens, her mind absorbing the information with terrifying speed. The scene that closed the chapter for the passengers in the cabin was unforgettable. They watched as the woman they had mocked and reviled, the woman they had deemed a homeless nobody, disappeared into the cockpit. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality. They were left in the groaning, shaking tube in the care of a complete stranger. The psycho in the hoodie, the armchair pilot, the disaster junkie that woman was now at the controls of their destiny. They sat in a stunned, horrified silence, grappling with a shocking, world-altering truth. Their lives were now in the hands of the very person they had judged to be worthless. And as the plane gave another terrifying lurch, all they could do was pray that their judgment had been wrong. The moment the cockpit door shut, it was as if a soundproof barrier had fallen between two different universes. Outside, in the cabin, was the world of fear and regret, a space defined by the chaotic emotions of helpless passengers. Inside was the world of cold, hard physics and methodical procedure, a realm where emotion was a liability. Ilara slipped into the co-pilot's seat with a fluid motion, her body instinctively molding to its contours. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pulled on the headset, her fingers moving with a practiced economy that silenced any lingering doubt the two pilots might have had. The cacophony of alarms was deafening, but to her, it was a diagnostic symphony. Each beep, each flashing light, was a piece of the puzzle. "Kill the autopilot," she commanded. Her voice through the headset was a new entity, stripped of all softness. It was a precise instrument of command. It's trying to compensate for ghost data from the failed sensors. It's putting you into a feedback loop. The captain, his face still slick with sweat, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his training screaming at him not to cede control to a civilian. But then he looked at the steep angle of their descent on the attitude indicator, a dive from which his own actions were not recovering them. He slapped the disconnect button. The plane shuddered as it was released from the faulty logic of its own brain, and for a moment it felt like it was falling even faster. "I have control," Ilara said, her hands already on the yoke. She wasn't fighting the plane. Her movements were small, precise, almost delicate. She was feeling the aircraft through the controls, sensing the pressures, the strains, the points of failure. She's heavy on the left wing, but the hydraulics aren't completely gone. We have residual pressure in the secondary lines. It's enough. She reached over with her free hand, her fingers flying across the central console. She bypassed the main hydraulic pump for the right ailerons and rerouted the auxiliary flow, a procedure that wasn't in any commercial flight manual. It was a battlefield improvisation, a trick learned in a cockpit filled with smoke over a hostile jungle, not in the pristine simulators of a passenger airline. Slowly, miraculously, the plane began to respond. The terrifying bank lessened. The nose, which had been pointed at the churning ocean below, began to lift. The horrifying sense of freefall was replaced by the familiar feeling of powered flight. The groaning of the airframe softened from a scream of protest to a weary sigh. Back in the cabin, the change was palpable. The violent shaking stopped, replaced by a steady, manageable turbulence. The severe tilt that had sent loose items sliding across the floor began to correct itself. It was the first glimmer of hope they had felt since the engine blew. A voice, calm and steady, came over the intercom. It was Ilara's voice, but transformed. It was the voice of command. "This is passenger 12B. We have stabilized the aircraft. The pilots are in control. Please remain seated with your oxygen masks on until further notice. We are beginning a controlled descent to a lower altitude." The effect of her words on the passengers was profound. Marcus Thorne sat rigidly in his seat, his face a mask of shame. He stared at the empty seat in row 12B, at the small indentation in the cushion where Ilara had sat, as if it were a holy relic. He had built an empire on his ability to judge people, to assess their value and their weaknesses. In the space of 10 minutes, this quiet woman had taken his entire worldview and shattered it into a million pieces. Genevieve Croft was weeping silently into her hands, her expensive jewelry feeling like cheap, worthless trinkets. Her insults, spoken with such confidence just minutes before, now echoed in her mind. each one a testament to her own shallow cruelty. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, deeply ashamed. Cody, the would-be TikTok star, had deleted the video. He stared at his blank phone screen, the reflection of his own pale, terrified face looking back at him. The psycho he had mocked was, at that moment, the only thing keeping him alive. He felt small, stupid, and profoundly grateful. The plane broke through the bottom of the storm clouds. The violent gray was replaced by a calm, twilight sky. Below them, the lights of a coastline twinkled like a promise. Alara's voice came on the intercom one last time. "This is your captain speaking," she began. "A small, necessary lie to maintain the fiction of order. We will be making an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport in approximately 20 minutes. Please prepare for landing." The cabin erupted, not in cheers, but in a wave of raw, unrestrained sobs of relief. Strangers hugged each other. People cried openly, without shame. They had been to the edge of the abyss and had been pulled back by the unlikeliest of saviors. The landing was perfect. The plane touched down on the runway so smoothly that it felt less like a landing and more like an arrival. As it taxied toward the terminal, surrounded by a swarm of flashing emergency vehicles, a new reality began to sink in. They were safe. They were alive. When the cabin door finally opened, the passengers did not rush out. They moved slowly, almost reverently, their steps unsteady. As they filed past the cockpit, many of them paused, peering in. They saw the captain and co-pilot, looking exhausted but alive, but the co-pilot's seat was empty. Alara was one of the last to leave the plane. She had slipped out just behind the flight crew, her gray hoodie pulled up, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She walked down the mobile stairs and onto the tarmac, her worn boots silent on the concrete. She didn't look for thanks. She didn't look for recognition. She simply walked toward the bright lights of the terminal, a ghost melting back into the crowd. At the press conference later that night, the airline spokesperson, a man with a perfectly knotted tie and a practiced smile, praised the heroic efforts of our highly trained flight crew. When a reporter pressed him about the rumors of a passenger who had saved the plane, he hesitated for only a second. "We are grateful for the assistance of a passenger who had prior aviation experience," he said smoothly. "Her name has not been released to protect her privacy." The passengers from Flight 815 never forgot her. They were bonded for life, not just by the trauma they had shared, but by the lesson they had learned. Marcus Thorne quietly sold his company and dedicated his life to philanthropy. Genevieve Croft volunteered at a homeless shelter, seeking a different kind of wealth. Cody went to college to become an aerospace engineer, inspired by the quiet woman who understood the language of a dying machine. They never knew her real name, or where she came from, or where she went. To them, she would always be the woman in seat 12B. She was a living, breathing lesson in the folly of judgment. She had shown them that heroes don't always wear capes or expensive suits. Sometimes, they wear faded gray hoodies. And sometimes, the person you are quickest to dismiss is the only one who can save you. Far away, in a small town nestled in the mountains, a woman walked into a quiet diner. She took a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee, black. The waitress saw the grease under her fingernails and the faint scar that ran along her wrist. She saw the worn canvas bag placed on the stool beside her. She saw nothing more than an ordinary woman, tired from a long day's work. And that was exactly how Alara Vance wanted it. She had done what she had to do. The world kept turning, the engines kept humming, and that was enough. It had to be.